Okay, so we're going to start Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6 is this whole section, Genesis 6 all the way through chapter 10, we have heard a million times. Most all of us have heard this since we were little kids. Most of us know. In fact, before I start, I sent out that text. A couple responded. I do have a couple of these responses, so I try to keep it anonymized so nobody would be shown. I asked on the remind text, what was the point of the flood narrative? This is the first one I got. You'll have to ignore the last part. That might kind of give it away. Sorry. Can God come to the end of his righteous rope with the signs, or with the sins of humanity, and has to do something drastic to get our attention? That was one answer. One, the Lord was disgusted with man and thought, to heck with this, and said he would just start over. That's my favorite one. It's a decreation. It's undoing days 2 and 3. That's a cheat. I'm just going to say that right now. Cheaters. Some of y'all have heard some of my talks before. And restoration. I'll open the same question to the room. What's the point of the flood narrative? We've heard this our whole life since we were little tiny babies, being read by mom and dad in the bed. What's the point of this flood narrative?
Was it like we were like basically doomed, like humanity, and so God would like restart it like through Noah?
Yeah.
Like to save race.
So kind of like the restoration, like that text, yeah? Mm-hmm.
Baptism, rebirth.
Baptism, rebirth. Can you give us a little picture of what baptism is going to look like? Yeah.
Necessitates Jesus.
Okay. Necessitates Jesus in a way. The righteous and blameless one. Yep. Anybody else?
Well, only because we talked about it before, but the ark represents a safe place.
Mm-hmm.
Eden.
Yep. And we'll dive more into that here shortly as well. Would you say that the flood has been taken and made glamorized in a way to be fitting to tell the story to children?
Especially to children.
I know some of y'all have made the trip to Kentucky where they have the giant ark up there. I know we've had conversations, some of us. What's your takeaway from when you went up to see that ark? Yeah, Wade?
So what really made that feel that way to me, that is very dumbed down and made more of a story for children in their eyes, is whenever they have this one display that's a huge table, it's a bunch of mountaintops, the ocean's coming up, the ark's floating, and there's thousands of people in the water climbing up the mountains, and to know that destruction was so bad back then, especially of the human race, that wasn't very glamorous. It wasn't the little happy giraffe sticking his head out of the ark window and everybody singing "Arky, Arky, Arky." You know?
Yeah.
It was ugly.
Can you remind us how that song goes?
Something like that.
Okay.
Arky or something. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
That trip, that was the biggest thing that stuck out to me.
For those who've not had conversations with me in the past, what's God overall viewed like? What's his overall stance throughout the whole situation? What's his posture? What do people, say God? How did he feel? What was his feelings? Where's he at in this whole ark story?
I think when he slams the door or shuts the door, I'm done.
Mm.
I mean, that's just what I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I could see him having some kind of remorse.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I don't want to do this, but you left me no choice, but I have to.
Kind of like when he gave
Kinda
his son
like
Jesus.
Yeah.
I don't want to have to do this.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
I do have to say, if you go to Branson or Pennsylvania, wherever, and watch the Noah's Ark thing, they portray it tragically. Like the people are screaming and begging and hollering to get in the boat. And they also portray it as everybody makes fun of Noah, and there's a lot of ridicule and stuff that goes on before, and then those same people are begging.
That's one thing that has kind of crept into our modern retelling of the stories is, and I don't think a lot of people even realize it, because most of the time, myself included, when you get to these narratives that you've read a million times, you tend to skim through it and kind of move on, right? And the idea of people laughing and ridiculing them during that and stuff, there's certain elements to this narrative that also come more from like the rabbinic traditions more so than the scriptures. And so those are some stuff there's stuff like that has crept into this story too. And so that's what This is one of the reasons why I wanted to get to this narrative, because this is one of those narratives that are incredibly important to get right. And to see it in the right lens, the right way, because it reveals so much of what God is doing and why he's doing it. Let me ask you this question. Why did God flood the entire earth? Why did he cause a mass extinction event? Because that's what this was, a mass extinction event. Okay? Sin?
Yeah, the earth was enveloped in bad.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing was.
Yeah.
The people were not doing what he planned. They
Yeah.
had gas.
Yeah.
He just
Yeah.
Well,
everything.
hadn't they spread out too?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Well, no, not yet. Not
They
yet.
hadn't spread out a whole lot?
That'll come during Babel. Now they have been spreading out in a way, but we're not told
But not
the mass until Babel, which will come later.
He was definitely disappointed
Mhm.
in the creation he had in mind. It was not what he had in mind, what
Yeah.
it turned out to be.
Mhm.
And he wanted it, I think, to start over.
Mhm.
Just to clean
So one of the questions that I would follow up with is, did this surprise God?
No.
Okay. Okay, we'll leave it at that because that might go down. We'll get there. We'll get to some of that, but
Do we know what the population of the earth was back
no
then?
idea. No.
No clue?
Nope. We're told one line. In those days when people began to multiply across the face of the earth. That's it. Okay.
Darn it.
No idea what that means. Okay. What I do find very important is the build up to this narrative is what we've seen from Genesis 1 all the way through Genesis 5 is we've seen repeating patterns, we've seen repeating phrases, we've seen things that have been implanted into the narrative that you will use to help discover the meaning and the message of any of the narratives that are to follow. And so just as a quick recap on your little sheets here, you're going to notice there's a couple drawings. The first one is this. This is the Genesis 1 account in drawing form, right? There's Jesus, he's created everything. There's Adam and Eve, they're in the garden, you can see the little snake and all that. That's important to keep in mind. The next thing, we're going to get the Genesis 3:15 account, which is going to give God's little pre-given plan of what's going to happen. That the woman are going to have seed or offspring, and the snake are going to have seed and offspring, and they are going to have enmity between them. But one day, one seed of a woman will crush the serpent or the snake altogether. That's where you get this whole mutual blow here with the serpent biting the heel of the person. And then, once you get outside of that, you're left with the question of, okay, are we dealing with actual snakes or are we dealing with something else? Once you get outside of the garden is where you get the next picture. And this is the pattern that has been laid out that we're now going to see on repeat over and over and over and over and over again in a greater and greater macro scale. Is they're exiled just east of the garden. We've got Adam and Eve. They have a couple of sons. One of the sons murders the other. Then that son is going to have a whole generation, and it'll lead to Lamech, who's the city builder, conquering two wife-taken guy, who's going to kill people just for wounding them. And then they're going to have another seed who will become Seth, and through Seth, his generations will become, is where we'll get Noah, who will bring the rest to the land. And this is a whole pattern of suddenly humans now have this option to become the seed of the serpent. And their choices will determine whether or not they're going to rule that sin, which desires are anti the individual, or they're going to let the sin rule them. Which all goes back to Genesis 1. Man was put on this earth to rule the beasts of the field, right? And in multiple layers of play, we're seeing that the beasts of the field are actually taking over and ruling. And so what we see in the micro scale here now becomes the macro scale between nations. And nations will rise up against nations, and all we're seeing is what was spilt on the ground and cursing the ground for one brother will now become whole nations who are spilling blood at the cost of whatever they want and whatever they see is right in their eyes. So they're tempted by something, they see it, they like it, they take it, and it results in further death and destruction and bloodshed and what we'll see setting up here. And from here, now what's going to happen is God is going to take Noah and his sons, and he's going to collapse everything back down on itself. The waters are going to no longer be parted. They're going to come back down. When you read the whole flood narrative, you'll see that the windows of the skies are open, the floodgates of the deep are open, and everything just fills back up. And no longer is there the mountain of God, no longer is the dry land. And instead of the garden in Eden, we're going to see a mini Eden that will show up for Noah and his family and the animals. And so here we are, back in Eden with Noah, family, and animals, and you'll never guess it ends up on a mountain, right? They get off and we're like, okay, we're back to Genesis 3 again. Here we go. We've done everything. It's all gone. All the bad is gone. We're back to this choice of man choosing to do what's right in his eyes versus man choosing to do what's right in God's eyes. Noah gets off the boat. He immediately sacrifices some clean animals. It becomes a pleasing aroma to the Lord, and you're like, this is great. This is awesome. Fantastic. So much so that God will say, hey, I'm never going to flood the whole earth again because now I know that every intention of man's heart is evil continuously. And you stop there because you realize that the whole point of the flood was because God looked down and saw that every intention of man's heart was evil continuously. And so the result of every intention of man's heart being evil continuously caused a decreation event. Now we're up here doing what's right, pleasing aroma, offering, great. But now he sees that every intention of man's heart is evil continuously. But you're left going, but what did Noah do? He did it right. For lack of better terms, he's Adam and Eve, and he didn't take the fruit. And then as you read the next statement, he plants a garden, he partakes in the fruit, ends up naked, and you go, oh no, we're back in Eden again. And then you're going to see the next generation is going to take it and repeat the cycle, and then it's going to get bigger and bigger. And you're going, thank the Lord, he's never going to destroy the earth like he did in the flood, because we're back there again already. In the first 10 chapters, we've done it twice. And this is a repeating pattern that we're going to see over and over and over again. Oh my, where can I go? On your handout, you'll see this little thing right here. What this is prototypical, incredible Hebrew writing, literature. Remember, verses, chapters were added much, much later. This was all meant to be read aloud in the midst of community like we do tonight. And by doing so, as you're listening to these narratives being read to you over and over from birth on, you begin to recognize patterns. You begin to recognize when these things begin to meet together. And what you see is from the first chapter all the way down to Abram, is you're seeing this exact thing on repeat. Chapter 1, creation and blessing. Then the failure, set up more like the folly failure. So Adam and Eve, did they know right and wrong? Well, technically no, but also they were also learning at the same time. It's almost like a kid who touched something hot after being told not. You're almost like, oh, come on. But you can't really fault them. They're learning, right? So it's like a folly failure. But then failure, the next generation is going to expose the real human heart, right? This is the murder. This is the murder of Abel. And then what you're going to see is the non-chosen genealogy, which will be Cain's, and the chosen genealogy, which will be Seth's. And then you're going to see this big cosmic rebellion take place here in chapter 6, which we'll get to. So now we have a rebellion of human. We've got a rebellion of in the cosmic, which we'll get into. And then we're starting the whole thing over again. If you see A and A, that's how they match up together, B and B. And if you go through each of these passages, you'll notice there's repeating words and phrases within each one that kind of help clue you in on this. So we're going to see a decreation, a recreation event, and a blessing again. Just like God said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. He's going to say the same thing again to Noah. But here we go. There's the folly, fall, the sin of the next of Noah, which is the nakedness. Then we're going to see the failure of the next generation, which we'll get to, which is Ham. And we're going to see the non-chosen race, which will be the 7 generations from Ham. And we're going to get Babylon and Assyria and all these things that are going to come into play later on. And we're going to see another cosmic rebellion take place in Babylon, which we'll get to, or Babel. And then we're going to see again the chosen generation, which will be the seed of Abraham. And all of these things are on repeat. And they're building this argument, right? The one that necessitates something else that's going to fix it. Because what's happening is that each one of these, even though they're repeating in narratives, are also slightly different, right? And it's going to continue that way all the way down until you get to, even if you go to Sodom and Gomorrah, it fits the same pattern. Sodom and Gomorrah, we've got the blessing of one through Abraham and Lot, and then we're going to see the failure of Lot, but not just Lot. His whole next generation is going to fail even worse, right? And the whole city is going to become the non-chosen city, the one that's going to be destroyed. And God promised not to flood the earth, so instead he rains down fire and decreates all of Sodom. And so it's all these little patterns that all fit this little tiny thing, because what's going to happen is by the time you get to the whole nation of Israel, they're now doing the same thing. The whole nation is going to fit the same pattern. The world's going to fit the whole same pattern. And it's going to need somebody who will come in and break it for good, which will necessitate Jesus. Any questions about that particularly? This is really fun as you read, especially these early chapters and all the early books in Genesis on, to see how they continue to fit this pattern and see how the authors will wink at you and be like, hey, he rained down fire. Like that's a good example. And you laugh because you go, oh, I see, it's funny because it's not rain this time. It's actually just fire and judgment, right? He did the same thing just with rain a couple chapters before this. But as you continue to move, then you'll see the next thing here are within these little narrative structures, within just the flood narrative itself, the writers are also coherently putting together the same type of structure. So we have that chiastic, if you remember from the Joseph study, that on your paper, we have that chiastic structure, which that chiastic structure is like that V structure. This one's more like a stair-step type structure, but this one, the V structure, what stands out in the V structure of the chiastic structure? So if A, B, B, C, C, and then D is in the middle, what's supposed to stand out in this type of structure?
Pivot.
Yeah, the pivot point. And so if you begin to follow what occurs from 6:1 all the way through 9, you're going to see this chiastic structure that works with the heavenly rebellion, and then it ends with the heavenly rebellion. There's an earthly rebellion, and there's going to be all these little elements that pivot in 8:1. And if you go to, we'll just go there. If you go to Genesis chapter 8, verse 1, you're going to get the whole point of the flood. So Genesis 8:1. And it's not going to load, that's okay. And this is what it says. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made the wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. There's the pivot point. Everything before that and after that are going to begin to line up. And you're going to see through repeating languages and phrases and inversions how that works. But the pivot point of the whole narrative is not the flood. It's that God remembered the blameless and righteous one, and through whom anyone connected will walk away in a new creation. And so there's that pivot point. Now insert yourself into ancient Babylon, and you're exiled as the nation of Israel, and you've been reading this whole narrative on repeat over and over and over again. And what do you walk away understanding as you're in what the psalmist will consider the belly of the beast, Babylon? God didn't forget us, but God remembered. He has a plan, and he will use that plan to fulfill that thing that he told us in all the way back in Genesis 3 with the seed and the serpent. Any questions about that? I see.
Question.
Yeah.
I probably shouldn't say this yet because we're not there, but when you just read that, and God remembered Noah, and and so God made a wind upon the earth. Well, I've just skimmed over that before, but and God remembered. Did God know I'm going to let it rain for 150 days and then I'm going to stop it, or did He just let it rain and then go, oh, I remember Him, and now I'm going to stop it?
So just like typical Hebrew literature is going to work, is you're not going to get these answers in that narrative. It's going to be revealed as you do that Proverbs 1 thing, that you ponder it, you look and understand wisdom by meditating on it, like Psalm 1 says, day and night, and you compare these narratives together, like what you did with Daniel and Jonah. And so what happens is when you get to later on in Genesis, in the Joseph story, and you hear over and over again that Joseph was forgotten, now you input what happened with Noah, and you go, well, is he really? God's not mentioned here. And then you get into later narratives like Esther and all these things, and you're seeing all of these times where you think that God has forgotten these promises, but at the end of the day, because of what we see through Noah, it's revealed that he's not forgotten anything, he's remembered. And it's not that he ever forgot. It's this little wink that you're going to use as a lens to read everything else after this, is that God has not forgotten. Now think about the end of the canon in the Hebrew Scriptures. You're left waiting, right? You're waiting for God to do what he promised to do all the way back in Genesis 3. Meanwhile, has he forgotten? Now come to 2023 and you're looking at the world and you're like, man, this is every intention of man's heart, evil continuously. It kind of feels like that. Did God forget about us? No. He's never forgotten. It's all been, he's been the one who's in control the whole time. Right? And so it's just those little tiny, yeah. So, any other questions before we move on? All those lovely things that we love to read, the genealogies that we realize revealed that there are two lines. One seems to be the seed of the serpent. One seems to be the seed of the woman. There definitely seems to be a chosen and a chosen race that God is going to continue to move through. We see this literary design, this thing on repeat. And so lives this many years, and he caused the birth of so and he so lived this many years. Right? It's a copy and paste format all through Genesis 5. Now Genesis 5 breaks at a couple points, which we realized was important, like when we see Enoch, who walked with God, and then he was hidden, he was taken from the earth because he was righteous and blameless. But the reason I bring that up is because there's something very interesting as you begin to look at these a little closer. Genesis chapter 3, here's a good example. So all the days of Lamech. Hey, look at that. We even have it up here. We're 770 years and he died. There's that formulaic copy and paste structure so that when reading, your eyes glaze over and hopefully you'll catch it when it varies. We start the flood narrative the exact same way. We see that in Genesis, I skipped ahead. Don't look at that one. Genesis chapter 5, we see, so all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and then he died. Noah was 500 years old, and Noah became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? Copy and paste from this right here. Except it's missing the next part. It's missing a part in this particular phrase because we will find the ending of it in Genesis chapter 9. Here's the rest of that copy and paste section. Noah lived 350 years after the flood. So all the days of Noah were 950 years, and then he died. Can you see that this is the end half of that copy and paste template? At the very end of the flood, we get that back, right? The reason that's important is because of this structure right here. This has become, for many, many years, biblical scholars and those who are critical of the Bible will use this as an argument against this whole narrative because they will say it was stolen, it was ripped off, it was whatever, insert the blank, right? Because what you see is, here's this copy and paste formula that we've been reading, and then it gets here, and then it's in the middle of it, it continues it, Genesis chapter 7, and Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters came upon the earth. Here we go, that's still the cut and paste template. And then it finishes, and Noah lived after the flood 350 years after the flood, and all the days of Noah were 950 years. So what it looks like is somebody came in and snipped out a portion of this, right, and inserted a whole narrative about the flood. Maybe filled in a blank, because we clearly had a flood here. It talks about it after the flood. Maybe began to fill in narratives. So maybe in the original composition that took place, whatever Moses maybe spoke about, and maybe if it was written down at that time, whatever happened is at a later time, somebody maybe came in and said, okay, here's what occurred here, and kind of snipped this template out and imported the flood narrative. Now that feels weird to us today, especially for us who have been told our whole lives that the Bible was, the first 5 books were written by Moses and that the Bible is perfect and all that. I agree that it was written by Moses and I agree that it's perfect. So how can I justify those two things but yet see something going on here? How can I justify that I said this is the author of Moses, but yet there's a pretty good possibility that this whole flood section was actually put in later?
Somebody was reading the part saying there's a flood. Ooh, there's nothing about a flood. Here, let's stick something in.
Yeah? Mm-hmm. So is this now written by Moses?
I mean, do we know? Because Moses could have said,
Yeah.
I didn't put the part about the flood in there.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. So this is a trick, because what we're doing is we're trying to implement authorship in the ways that we know it in the modern days. Authorship, somebody might sit down and write it, or might speak to a ghostwriter. That ghostwriter might write it under a pseudonym or whatever it may be. That's the way authorship works. Authorship back then did not work, right, that way. Because not everybody wrote, not everybody went through the schooling to be able to create scrolls and to go through all of that. And more likely what happened is that over generations of campfire stories being told around of each night with the family and in the gathering of the families, they began to solidify in nature, and at some point somebody came down and wrote this stuff down. There's multiple points to that. We can talk about that at a different time if you want to, but the Bible, it's not weird. The Bible talks about when God tells Moses to write something on a scroll, it talks about, hey, we borrowed this from the scrolls of such and such, the wars of the kings. It talks about those things. But keep this in the back of your mind, because we're going to come back to it here in a few minutes. Because one of the main arguments is that this was actually just a stolen narrative, a stolen flood narrative from someone else, something else, right? We kind of hinted at it a week ago or so. I talked about the fact that there's over 300 different flood accounts across the world. Now, logistically, obviously, I think that would occur. Now, if Babel took place literally, and it literally happened the way that we looked at it, then the people whose languages were separated as they were diversely segregated across the world, they're going to develop their own myths, their own legends based off of something that actually took place, a worldwide catastrophic flood. There was a scholar in the 1800s, his name is George Smith. He was tasked with taking these thousands of pieces, fragments of tablets and scrolls that they had found in modern-day Iraq. And what he did as he began to study these thousands and thousands of fragments is he realized this was a library. Somebody had compiled together worldwide literature and put it in a library in Iraq, and at some point it had been buried, destroyed, whatever it was, and it was discovered in the 1800s. And so he spent 25 years piecing together all these fragments, trying to figure out which stories go with what and how it came out. As he was doing that, he began to realize that there were actually 5 different flood accounts in this Babylonian library, one of which is the biblical account, one of which is the actual biblical account. If you look at your handout, I actually have them there. Every single time I click on the wrong thing here. So here's the 5 different flood accounts. Now this is 5 of over, like I said, 300. So there are over 300. This is actually something that many scholars, or many of those who are critical of the Bible, this is what they will argue against. Oh, I didn't put that on there? That's okay. It's up here now, so there you go.
I ain't got it.
So here's the 5 ancient flood stories, and if you look at them, the oldest one here seems to be the 16th century BCE Sumerian Babylonian version of the Eridu Genesis, which is a whole boring story. It's not even that interesting. Next is the 17th century Akkadian version of the Epic of Atrahasis. Then we've got the 13th century Akkadian version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Many of you probably have heard of that one. That's one of the most famous ones next to the biblical account. But then we have the biblical version, which was dated anywhere from the 12th to 6th century BCE. And then a 3rd century BCE version was preserved in the writings of the Babylonian priests and whatever that word is, Berosus. So logically, you look at this and you see that for 3 centuries, 4 centuries or more, there were 3 other accounts of the flood that were written down, and they all are different from the biblical account in many, many, many ways. So then you get to the biblical version, which is the oldest known version of this particular account, and then you have critics of the Bible go, see, they stole it, right? So now what do you do in 2023 when you have a whole church who spent their whole life saying 2 by 2 they walked into the boat and God filled happy sun rays, with the lovely animals and Noah, and while everybody else died a mass extinction event, and you go, see, look, and they just ripped this off from something else, Babylonian. And then any smart scholar who goes and look, you could see the seams where they split up this template and inserted the flood into it. You could pull it out completely. Well, then you have a bunch of Christians who are like, oh, I don't know, because we don't look at our Bible or study it or read these narratives that are 6 pages into the Bible. So what do we do with that? Well, in this study, this particular professor, he gave this incredible speech afterwards with his findings. He realized that there were some similarities to all of them. Here are the similarities. Number one, all of them had some sort of a divine decision that was made and to send a punishing flood. One chosen man is told to save himself and his family and creatures by building a boat. The boat's proportions and design are designed to imitate a sacred temple, which we'll get into eventually. A great flood destroys the rest of all the people. The boat runs aground a mountain. Birds are sent out to determine the availability of the habitable land. The hero offers a sacrifice to the gods, and humanity is renewed on the land. All of these 5 narratives, all of these 5 accounts within this one collection all agree on those things. And if you sit there and see that, so we can kind of establish a couple views. Number one, well, yeah, of course these all agree because it all actually happened at some point during the translations and transmissions of this narrative. Some of them took on their own, versions until the biblical one was written down or whatever it may be. I actually hold a different view. My view is that someone later, at a different time, probably more likely during the Babylonian captivity, so when Israel is in captivity, took something that truly happened and wrote it into this narrative as a way to show who the real one true God is. Because when it's not in the similarities that the difference is made, it's actually in the differences. And I have a couple of those differences. Okay, we just looked at that. Okay, so for instance, if we look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is just, you can go and listen to this and read this today. It's very interesting, and we'll get into this a little bit more at a later time. What we're going to see is all of these things have a lineup, and some of them, almost word for word, speak very, very similar aspects. So if you can take a picture of this afterwards if you want to and go look it up. It's really, really interesting. But if you go to this table, this is the one I want to see. Here's where the difference is, and I want you to see if you can see what I'm talking about, why this maybe was inserted for a particular reason. In the Mesopotamian flood stories, the gods grow tired of the noise and disorder of humanity and make a rash decision that some gods regret to destroy them with a flood. Well, in the Genesis flood story, God hears the outcry that results from humanity. I can't read this. There's lights all over. The reflection's so bad. Okay, that's good. That's good. That's why I'll read it out loud. Oh, how do I do that?
Over here.
Over here? That's a good idea. Any better? There it is. God hears the outcry that results from humanity's moral corruption and violence and sees their inclination to ruin his world. In the Mesopotamian, the assembly of the gods tried to conceal the flood plan from the humans. That's not even in the Genesis one, so we can ignore that. The chief god decrees total human destruction. Only one hero is saved by a rebel deity who secretly informs him about that coming threat. This was found in 3 of the main oldest transcripts. God views Noah as the only faithful human and initiates a warning to him and instructs him himself on how to take care of this. The duration of the flood is either 7 days, according to one, or 6 days and nights, according to the other. God offers 7 days warning, followed by 40 days of storm, followed by 150 days of recession, followed by multiple stages of 7 days, until the flood is over, 1 year and 10 days from its beginning. The scope of destruction varies in the accounts. In the first one, total destruction is ordered by the gods. In Gilgamesh, all the people turn back into clay, though the tops of the mountains are still visible. Here, all the high mountains were covered. There was water over all the surface of the land. Here, the inhabitants of the boat include a pilot, craftsman, and lots of animals. Noah and his family in pairs of animals. The gods are hungry after 7 days of no food and swarm around the sacrifice. Noah's sacrifice is pleasing to God, but not to satisfy divine hunger. Rather, it is an act of thanks. The gods establish a sign. A female goddess dons a blue shiny necklace that reminds the gods to never bring the flood again. God establishes the sign or a covenant in a rainbow and remind humans of God's promise. The humans are obligated not to shed blood again. The flood hero is given divine life and become demigod like that person, or invited to Mount Dilmun, the eternal realm of the gods. Noah receives the new humanity commission, but he immediately fails in his own garden. So what do you think about the 2 variations here? What's your initial gut instinct about these?
I believe the Bible.
Good, as you should, yes.
Just fairy tales. They just erred, and they they wrote down.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Did you have something?
More like Greek mythology.
Greek mythology, yeah.
Different gods for different things.
Yep.
I can see Greek mythology.
Yep.
In the other account, it sounds like the gods are capricious and
Mm.
act on a whim,
Yeah.
and nothing's planned. The God's orderly.
Yeah.
And everything is structured,
Yeah.
and it's all up to Him. There's no other interference of any fake.
Yeah. Absolutely. Much like what you discover by comparing the ancient Babylonian, the ancient Mesopotamian recounts of creation, what you see in the Christian accounts, or the God, Yahweh accounts, is a God who is personal, a God who is within his creation, a God who is in partnering with his creation. Here we're looking at a God who is aching from this, not annoyed by it. He is regretful, but wants to bring a remnant. Here it's like, well, we got to have somebody who's going to feed us because we're hungry. You can see various amounts of differences, and to know that in the ancient Babylon world that Nebuchadnezzar will claim to be an ancient descendant of the offspring of this flood of Gilgamesh. To know and to hold that as a badge of honor. Meanwhile, we all claim to be of offspring of Noah, and for us, it's not necessarily like a badge of honor. It's just more of like well, yeah, he's human, he failed. There was still a problem afterwards, like it needed to be fixed. It necessitated something else. What you see is in the variation of it, you start to see a different God who is coming to view. And so now if you are in ancient Babylon and you are exiled there and you are one of the ones who know the narrative of the flood because it actually happened, 300 different accounts account for that, now you're going to put that within this in this scroll to help those who may read it discover the variations, using the languages and the narratives and the stories that they're all familiar with. And they're going to go, well, that God, that's different. That's different than what I've been told since I was a baby. I heard the gods were annoyed with us and we were too noisy and annoying, so they all just wanted to destroy us. This God's like aching and regretting that he even made man, and he's personal, and he wants to make a covenant with them and wants to partner with them, not just enslave them to perform his wills. Thoughts or questions about this?
I just like the fact that on the right is big G-O-D.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Well, if you read that the way I do, it's like these guys were doing it for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
On the other side, the guy's doing it for us, not for him.
Yep. Exactly. Yep. It's more of the problem needs to be fixed for the gods, and here the problem needs to be fixed for the humans, ultimately. Every intention of man's heart is evil continuously, and so God's going to come and begin to help perpetrate that fix, ultimately. Yeah?
Now, the out of the flood account, it had to happen pretty early in, the stories and things.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't, like you said, Moses wrote and they said
Yeah.
that this was added, but it had to have been added early
Yeah.
because everybody knew it
Yeah.
and taught their kids.
Yes, and you don't have to fall on this, it was written during a Babylonian exile. That's just a theory. That is 100% a theory kind of thing. But yes, it has been in there a long time. And when comparing these, I think, much like the creation thing was not to create divisions within the church based off of your own literal or non-literal or symbolic reading of 7 days of creation. It was more about the why of creation, not the how of creation. This flood narrative becomes the same thing. It's less about the literal nature of it, less about the symbolic nature of it, and more about the why of it. What is it revealing about God, less about what's actually occurring on this earth with regards to the flood. There are multiple beliefs when it comes to the flood narrative. There are multiple. People believe it was a worldwide flood. What are some of the ones that you've heard before? Huh? A regional flood? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Huh? Yeah, figurative. Maybe it was just more of a literary device. Mm-hmm. Just a teaching point, yeah. That's something you got to kind of work out, in your own heart, where you land on that. The Bible does not necessitate necessarily, it probably eliminates others more than some, but it doesn't necessitate necessarily that you take one stance or the other. This is one of those moments where we have to begin to back out and not rely so much on all these things that have divided us, and concentrate more on the things that we can all agree about. And those things that we can all agree about are who this God is and what he's doing to fix the problem, and how it's setting us up to understand every single thing that will be written from that point forward, all the way to Jesus. That is the world that we're living in, or that is the world that we are in when we open Genesis chapter 6, verse 1. And if you have that in mind, and you can drop all of those preconceived notions and understandings, and you're willing just to sit there and listen, you begin to see the pattern continues. It's on repeat, and we're watching it begin to get worse, and it's teaching us more about who God is and less about what the world is, because the world's always been that. And it's more about God revealing how he's continually fixing this problem. And so Genesis chapter 6, verse 1, and we're going to read just a few verses, and we're going to leave it on a cliffhanger because we don't have time to even begin to jump into this part. But I just want you to think through what you're hearing here. Okay? Keep this in mind. We've watched on repeat humans rebel, a cosmic rebellion already with the serpent, and the serpent being multiple layers of both Satan and a beast of the field that man should have ruled. And now we're going to watch how, we've seen stories where God will take, or where man will take the blessing or the protection of Cain's mark and use it for their own will. They will take that blessing and begin to use it to enact revenge in Lamech. For anybody who may harm Lamech, you see him take sevenfold revenge of God for Cain. He's going to take that and use that in his own heart. He will avenge them 70 times sevenfold. He's going to take these blessings and make them into curses against humanity. We've seen all that on repeat. And so now what we're going to see is chapter 6, verse 1. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them. If we stop right there, we go, yay! It's the blessing that he gave to Adam and Eve. Be fruitful and multiply. Right? When this happened and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive. And when you hear that right there, immediately what comes to mind? What have we seen before? Seeing that something is tempting, seeing that fruit, sees it's attractive, sees that they want it, takes it, ends in death, separation, exile. When they see this, they saw the daughters of men were attractive, and they took as their wives any that they chose. The Lord says, my spirit will not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days are 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. And we'll stop right there, because you should be going, I got so many questions. What in the world just happened? Okay, we have a couple minutes. Open the floor for questions or clarifications, and then we'll pray, and if you need to talk afterwards, we can.
I sure wish Scott was here.
Look, I'm texting him right now.
Is that what the days of the men became shorter? Because it says.
I wonder if we'll get into that next week.
But then Noah lived 990.
Interesting that Noah still lived a lot longer than 120 years. Nice catch there. Nice. Very interesting. I wonder what that means. Plug that one away. Any other thought? Did anybody else feel like that was like a hard interjection in the middle of that? Like I got some questions about the sons of God thing first. Now we're talking about, you're like, wait, what?
Sons of God.
Yeah.
I cannot get
Yeah, it's good. It's good. It's fun.
I can't get it. I don't understand sons of God.
You will.
What I'm telling you
Yeah.
is when they talk about 40 days and 40 nights,
Mm.
and then you see 40 use
Yeah.
the repetition of
Yep.
what you're saying.
How many wives did they take? They took wives,
Wives, yeah.
all of which they chose.
This is good. I love that we're ending right here.
Yeah.
This is such a perfect place. I love it. I hope you will spend all week it just bothers you.
And then it says the giants, so we're talking about the giants of, where
Interesting thought.
David and Goliath.
Interesting thought. Any questions to anything before Genesis 6 at this point? Because we'll dive right into that next week. It would take more. Can I just be honest with you? Just as a testimony. This one passage right here changed everything in my entire life. Outside of the gospel. Don't anybody get upset about that. I don't want to downplay the gospel. The gospel saved my life. post-salvation, this one passage right here changed everything in my entire life when it came to my relationship with God and my relationship with His Word. Because I read this as a high schooler, randomly, in one of those, you get in that January 1st time frame, you're like, I'm going to go through the whole Bible in a year. I'm going to do it. And then I get to like page 5, and I'm like, all right, I'm done. I give up already.
Puts me in diets.
Yeah. I get to this, and I just happened to read it for the first time. You guys know what that's like. You read it for the first time, and you go, wait, what? And I have to just be honest with you. I sought the answer to this for years. People that I love and respect and are very knowledgeable in the Bible just would either not recognize it or would tell me some of the views that we'll talk about. And it bothered me. It always bothered me. I just never felt like it was an adequate answer. I stumbled across this guy that I've named a couple different times. His name's Mike Heiser. I'll go to the grave saying this guy's brilliant. His whole thing is this. So if you want to dive into this stuff, he explains it. He's amazing. Look up his books. They're all amazing. Read them all. Read every one of them. You will not look at any single Bible passage from this point forward the same way once you discover what's being said here. For years and years and years, it just bugged me. And until I discovered that, then I realized that it changes everything. And the problem is that there's two main views, and we'll end with this. We won't go into them. There's two main views. One is these are humans that are having kids with other humans. The other one is what?
Angels.
Yeah. For lack of a better term, angels. I'm going to go with heavenly beings. I think our view of angels and demons are actually way smaller than what they actually are. I'm going to go with heavenly beings. And if you look at humans raping women versus heavenly beings raping angels, it does a lot more to how you read Scripture. And you go, ugh, that seems, I don't know about that. But I'm going to tell you, the thing that changed my life, the gospel, happened as an inversion to this narrative. A woman was impregnated by a god. And when you begin to see how all this stuff fits together, you go, oh, now I get how we got the Greek gods. Suddenly, all these other religions that we've seen in the past, now they all make sense. Because it all trickles down from this very 3 verses. In those days, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took for themselves wives, any that they chosen, and the Nephilim were in those days. And you're just like, hold up, what? Don't take this lightly. It's icky. Don't be afraid of the ickiness. And walk away believing whichever view you want. It's okay. I'm not here to actually convince you. I will try to convince you. But if you walk away going, I agree to disagree, that's great, because there are amazingly brilliant biblical scholars who are absolutely polar opposites of each other, and that's okay. Because it's not, it's what it is. All right. Questions? If not, we'll pray. Would somebody mind closing this out? Thank you, Ken.
Father God, thank you for this day, and thank you for those that are here. For those that are not here, let them know that they are loved and that they are missed. Father, I pray that we continue to follow your word in the way possible, and we just pray for righteousness, and we just pray for peace. And I just thank you for speaking through Brother Adam and what he had in store for us. But Lord, we want to continue to follow your true word, because you are the way, the truth, and the life. Father, we praise you and we love you. We praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.